I don't know about you, but I'm not just looking for fat turkeys this week. I'm looking for some fat fantasy points on my lineup. In a week with no bye weeks and football on 4 separate days, I think we're going to have plenty of options to fatten us up. So in this episode, we're talking about wide receivers and who we should start and sit in week 12. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Happy Thanksgiving week. Hopefully you're going to have a chance to kick back, relax, watch some football, hang out with the family, and just really enjoy your time here during the holiday this week. But before we hop into the festivities and start to enter food coma stage, I need to give something away. It's only fitting here in a holiday week, right? So I have a signed Davante Adams mini helmet right here, the alternate salute to service helmet. This thing is sweet. It's from our friends over at Pristine Auction. And I just want to give this away to somebody down below in the comment section. But how do you enter this giveaway? It is super simple. Hit the like button, leave a comment down below so I know you're interested, and then be sure to have your free account signed up at pristineauction.com using the referral code Headliners. Setting up that account costs you absolutely nothing, and when you use our referral code Headliners, we're actually going to put a $10 coupon into your account. Now, the holidays are right around the corner, right? So I highly suggest browsing through that site, and you're going to find something for a loved one. I absolutely guarantee it, and then you'll get to use that coupon and get a few dollars off your order. If I could offer a little bit of a tip here, go to the 10-minute auctions during the weekdays. Great deals all week long. I mean, you can get autographed jerseys for as low as like $40. Be sure to check it out. But just as important, I have one other thing to talk to you guys about here today before we get into all the football matchups. If that's all you care about, there are timestamps down below, but I am still on a mission to help get kids out of extreme poverty. So far this season, we've had 9 children sponsored. We've made a huge donation in the name of Headliner Nation, but we still have a large chunk of kids that we need to get sponsored before the Super Bowl. There is nothing more that I would like than to get some more kids some help during the holiday season. So let's go ahead and meet this week's Compassion Kids of the Week. The first one up, it's little Firo Mesa. He's 4 years old, lives in Ethiopia, and he's been waiting for a sponsor for 339 days. But we have a second child as well. This is Liz. She's 4 years old, lives in Bolivia, and has been waiting for a sponsor herself for 399 days. I would love to be able to bring a smile to these children's faces during the holiday season. Is there anyone out there in Headliner Nation that is able to help out one of these 2 children here this year? If there is, there's a link down below in the description to compassion.com/headliners. You probably also saw a child ID on the pictures that we just had up on the screen. If you go to compassion.com/headliners, you can actually search for the child by their ID. If you get to that point and they've already been sponsored, that's great for those kids. Thank you very much. But there are other kids available on our website that need our help. Compassion has actually given us our own little part of their website. Those children that you find on compassion.com/headliners, they're only available to this community. They are solely reliant on all of us stepping up and helping them escape extreme poverty, and I know we can absolutely knock it out of the park. Once again, links down below in the description, compassion.com/headliners, but now it's time to talk some football, and we don't just have one Thursday game. No, Thursday is Turkey Day, and we have ourselves a trio of football games. The first one up, the Green Bay Packers, Detroit Lions. And I don't know if you remember or not, but it was this show just last week that we sat here and talked about Jayden Reed and how I said this could be the potential breakout week for Jayden Reed in week 11. I then proceeded to tell a ton of people last week to start Jayden Reed in their fantasy football lineups. It just happened to work out because he finished top 12 overall at the wide receiver position now. I never would have guessed that the bulk of his points would have come from 46 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, but fantasy points are fantasy points. But in that game, we also had a touchdown to Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson. How Christian Watson is it, though, that he scores a touchdown and still doesn't get double-digit points, and then he goes immediately right back on to the injured list? But last week was all about matchup. We talked about it in depth. You want to start opposing wide receivers against the Los Angeles Chargers. They allow a crap ton of fantasy points. But what about this week? Now they have a game on the road in Detroit. Detroit allows the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and the injury report right now is stocked full of playmakers in Green Bay. Listen to this laundry list of names: Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon, Luke Musgrave, Dontavian Wicks, and of course, Christian Watson. Now, while I expect most of those names to be active here this week and really just getting some early week rest because of the short week, Dontavian Wicks is definitely a name I'm paying attention to closely. He just had 91 yards receiving in that game last week. And with some of these other playmakers banged up, he could definitely get an opportunity once again here this week against Detroit. But that doesn't mean that I'm totally discounting Romeo Doubs or Jaden Reed for the week either. The biggest concern for me in this matchup is there's not going to be as many touchdowns to go around if I had to guess. And if that's the case, you got a bunch of pass catchers eating into each other's ceiling. So as of right now, this is how I would rank the pass catchers in Green Bay this week. It's still Romeo Doubs, then Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, and then Christian Watson. Why Christian Watson last? Justin Watson has more points this year than Christian Watson, if that tells you anything. But what about for Detroit? And unfortunately, Amon-Ra last week saw his streak of 100-yard receiving games come to an end at 4. Week 11 was only the third time all season long that he didn't get over 100 yards receiving in a game. But he found the end zone, so no harm, no foul. He's now finished as a top 12 wide receiver in 5 of his last 6 games played. He's averaging over 10 targets per game, but I do need to say this. One of the other games he had this season where he failed to get 100 receiving yards in a game was this game against Green Bay earlier in the season. And on paper, Green Bay continues to be a tough matchup. They allow the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but their defense is totally banged up right now. Devondre Campbell, Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, Jair Alexander, and the list goes on and on and on. That defense is definitely hurting. Meanwhile, in Detroit, their offense stays pretty healthy. There is no other wide receiver here in Detroit that sees enough volume to even consider. Amon-Ra, on the other hand, is about as locked and loaded a must-start guy each and every week in your fantasy lineups. Which will then take us to the second game on Thanksgiving. By this time, you're on like portion 4 of mashed potatoes and gravy, but that's when the Washington Commanders and Dallas Cowboys are going to be playing. For Washington, there may not be a more annoying group of wide receivers to try and figure out weekly than Washington. McLaurin sees the most targets. Dotson gets the touchdowns, but 11 different players last week caught passes from Sam Howell, and no one went over 60 yards receiving. Now, Terry McLaurin on the year, no games over 100 yards and only 2 touchdowns. How about Jahan Dotson? He's got touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games, but he only has 23 total yards receiving in his last 2 games combined. Maybe Curtis Samuel. Nope, not really. Samuel has only 11 yards over his last 2 games combined, and he was just kicked out of the game in week 11. Now they get a matchup going up against Dallas. Dallas allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We do know that Antonio Gibson has a chance to miss this game once again in week 12, but we're really trying to chase who scores the touchdowns weekly. All of these guys are super boomer bust, and there is no consistency with any of them across the board. It really makes it hard for me to put any of them inside my top 25 to 30, especially in a difficult matchup like this. What about for Dallas? Now, CeeDee Lamb, he saw his historic streak come to an end in week 11 as well. He had 3 straight games with over 10 catches and over 150 receiving yards. Dallas, though, they got a huge lead against Carolina, and Lamb, even though he had 6 catches for 38 yards and a touchdown, he still scored double digits for your fantasy team despite not having a huge day. But it's matchups like this that force us to look at other pieces in this offense, a la Brandon Cooks this week for me in week 12. Sure, he had a down game in week 11 as well, but he's now averaging over 13 yards per reception on the season and really has the ability to do more with less. A matchup against Washington, how do you say no to it? They're allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, Lamb right now is currently on the injury report with an ankle injury, but don't worry, more than likely it's just rest because of the short week. Nothing major, not expected to miss this game. Lamb, we know, is already a locked and loaded starter in your fantasy lineups, but Brandon Cooks for me this week is definitely a name I'm paying attention to. Now, sure, for a lot of people, that's going to be deeper leagues, maybe those with multiple flex spots, 3+ wide receivers in a lineup. But maybe also for those of you who play some underdog pick'ems, that's definitely a line I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit later in the week. which will then take us to the third game on Thanksgiving. By now, your pants are unbuttoned and you're borderline passing out on the couch, but San Francisco and Seattle will be ready to kick off, and this one is actually going to be my Manscaped matchup of the week. For whatever reason, so many people wait until after the Thanksgiving holiday to do their Christmas shopping. But let's go ahead and knock out a few presents here early in the holiday season. Every one of us out there has someone in their life that could probably use a little bit of a trim. Now, you don't have to buy some awkward present for a family member. However, if you do, the laughs are something you'll never forget. But they truly have something for everyone. It's boxer briefs, shampoo, deodorant, lip balm, whatever it is you need, Manscaped has you covered. Now get it at a discount. Go ahead and knock out a little bit of your Christmas shopping early in the holiday season. Head over to manscaped.com, use promo code headliners at checkout for that 20% off and free shipping. Links down below in the description. But what about this matchup? And we'll kick it off with San Francisco. And when we get a San Francisco offense led by Brock Purdy, who's out there on the field doing the Major League Big Balls dance, you know this offense is humming. I just used humming and balls in the same sentence. Oh, well, let's go ahead and run with it, because three of the big four playmakers here in San Francisco have found themselves scoring touchdowns now in back-to-back games. This offense as a whole hasn't scored less than 27 points in a game when they've been fully healthy. Now, Miami, they get a lot of love for their offensive firepower, but I really believe that San Francisco, when they're fully healthy, is way more consistent week in and week out with their fantasy studs. Now they get a matchup going up against Seattle. They allow 28.7 fantasy points per game, which is right around league average to opposing wide receivers. Still, this offense overall fairly healthy. However, they did just lose a piece of their defense with safety Talanoa Hufanga, who is now out for the year with a torn ACL. Now, while Brandon Ayuk may be the more consistent option in the passing game, it's that yak ability of a healthy Deebo Samuel that really makes him hard to sit. Plus, you know that usually every week you can pencil him in for a few carries out of the backfield. In a matchup here late on Thursday night to wrap up Thanksgiving, both of the San Francisco wide receivers are going to be top 24 options for me here this week. But what about in Seattle? This offense is a little bit more difficult to figure out weekly. But now with the injury to Kenneth Walker, you have to think they're going to have to rely more on their passing game. DK Metcalf right now has back-to-back games with at least 13 fantasy points scored, while Tyler Lockett continues his streak of being up and down every other week. Now, Jackson Smith and Jigba, he looks more and more comfortable in this offense each and every week, but he's not getting enough volume to really consider being a safer start in this offense. DK has averaged almost 10 targets per game over his last 4 games played, and Tyler Lockett has only had 10 targets in a game twice all year. Now a matchup going up against San Francisco. That can't be good, right? Well, actually, they allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. A lot of teams playing catch up, and garbage points add up. Now, technically, as of right now, DK Metcalf is one of the only wide receivers not on the injury report heading into this game. But most importantly, don't forget that Geno Smith suffered an injury to his elbow back in week 11, but Pete Carroll has already come out and said he should be good to go. He should play this week with no issues. Now, while I feel a lot more comfortable with the starting wide receivers in San Francisco, I do believe that DK Metcalf does possess a pretty safe floor once again this week. It is super hard to run on San Francisco, and Seattle just lost their number 1 running back. I expect Geno Smith to have to air it out all 4 quarters, and if you want to start Tyler Lockett, you need to hope that he brings in a long touchdown, because if he doesn't, he's probably not going to give you a very good fantasy day. Give me the overall volume week in and week out to DK Metcalf. But now you probably think that we can head over to some Sunday football. We got a game on Friday this week. That's right, Black Friday, got a football game in the afternoon. It's the Miami Dolphins and New York Jets. Will kick it off in Miami. And you want to hear something crazy? Right now, Tyreek Hill has 215.4 points in half PPR scoring. That would be enough to make him the quarterback 3 overall. He's producing so much, it's like starting 2 quarterbacks in your 1 quarterback league. We know he never comes out of your fantasy lineup. But what about Jalen Waddle? He continues to kind of sputter in this offense. He's just not getting the ball in space like he has in years past. His yards before contact is a whole 4 yards less in 2023 than it was in 2022. But you know that in this game, Tyreek gonna get a little bit of sauce, which means Jalen Waddle could get himself some extra looks. looks. But obviously, it doesn't look like this is a great matchup on paper, right? The Jets, they allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers of any team in the NFL. But we also know that Devon Chan, he suffered a setback. He's injured once again. Braxton Berrios and tight end Durham Smythe also questionable to play in this ballgame. We for sure haven't seen the ceiling from Waddle much this year, but at this point, I don't know if I'm ready just to say we need to sit the guy. It has to be the case for over 90% of the fantasy teams out there. At worst, Jalen Waddle should at least be in your flex. There's no way I'm going into a week where I'm sitting a healthy top-tier option of the Miami Dolphins. Now, on the other side of the football, man, I'm feeling for Garrett Wilson right about now. He had that emotional high all offseason, getting Aaron Rodgers as his quarterback. Then he lost Aaron Rodgers and had to go to Zach Wilson. Okay, I'll make up for it by doing whatever I have to just due to the volume I'm going to get. I'm going to make things happen this year regardless. Then now he gets Tim Boyle, and he basically has to start all over again and try to continue to produce with subpar quarterback play. And now he has to do it in a game against Jalen Ramsey. The volume has been great all year, but this may be too much for him to overcome this week. Now, Miami, they allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but don't forget, Jalen Ramsey just returned 3 weeks ago and has 3 interceptions through 3 games. Now, this offensive line as well just lost another big piece. Tackle Mekhi Becton, scheduled to miss a week or 2 with a low ankle sprain. Now, Garrett Wilson isn't some must-sit guy by any means. That is not what I'm saying. But the safety that we've had from him, just due to the volume, it may not be there anymore. It's kind of like learning all over again, what is this Jets offense going to be like? He turns into a very high-risk, boomer bust play each and every week, especially in a difficult matchup like this one against Miami and Jalen Ramsey. I'm really hoping he can still be at least a flex option, but even those days may be coming to an end soon. But now finally we can head over to some Sunday football, a matchup between the New Orleans Saints and Atlanta Falcons. Now for New Orleans, the storyline here is all about the quarterback situation. And at the time of this recording, Derek Carr is still technically in the concussion protocol and questionable to play. If he can't go this week, we're gonna see Jameis Winston once again under center for the New Orleans Saints, which honestly probably gives the Saints wide receivers a little bit of a higher ceiling, just makes them a little bit more risky. For Chris Olave, for the most part, he's been a solid wide receiver 2 each and every week this season. He's currently the wide receiver 20 overall and is averaging just under 10 targets a game and right around 11 fantasy points per contest. Now Rashid Shaheed, he's a lot more boom or bust. He has scored single-digit points in 70% of his games this season. His big games, though, are pretty freaking big. But now they get a matchup going up against Atlanta, and this one isn't an easy matchup. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but you don't see Michael Thomas's name here on the screen, and that's because they're going to be without him more than likely for a couple weeks in this offense. But not only that, their defense could be without a top playmaker as well. Marshawn Lattimore, questionable to play. He may miss a couple more weeks. At this point of the season, though, you can't get too cute. You start your studs each and every week. Chris Olave remains the safer option in this offense week in and week out. As for Rashid Shaheed, though, he is definitely somebody that I would pay attention to, more so in a DFS type format or an underdog pick'em type format. All he really needs is one big play to give you a huge fantasy day. The problem is, they just don't happen very often. Now for their opponents in Atlanta, it's really only Drake London that we need to talk about. And how crazy does this sound? Drake London is only 10 points away from being outside the top 50 overall wide receivers in fantasy football. Thanks, Arthur Smith. I mean, this guy hasn't scored 10 fantasy points in a game since week 6. He's only had 1 game all year long with double-digit targets, doesn't have a touchdown since week 4, and has only gone over 70 yards receiving 2 times all season long. I mean, listen, I wasn't a Drake London truther this offseason. I had him as a player to avoid, somebody I didn't really want to draft. But even this is way worse than I had expected. Especially when you look at this overall team, there's not a whole lot of options each and every week. He should be getting tons of volume. But now they get a matchup going up against New Orleans. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but don't forget, we did just mention how New Orleans is more than likely going to be without top defensive back Marshawn Lattimore, and that makes a difference. Now for Atlanta overall, they're fairly healthy. Mac Hollins still questionable to play in this ball game, but the best game of the year that we saw from Drake London was back in week 6, but that was against the Washington Commanders. Everyone has a great game against the Washington Commanders. Drake London remains a high-risk play in an offense that doesn't score a whole lot of points. If he doesn't score a touchdown, more than likely he doesn't sniff 10 fantasy points, and that's worrisome at this point of the fantasy season. On to a matchup, though. The Pittsburgh Steelers and Cincinnati Bengals will kick it off in Pittsburgh, and no more Matt Canada. I know there are a ton of Steelers fans out there happy about that, but unfortunately, we still have Kenny Pickett as the quarterback, so not all things are great in Pittsburgh. Now, while I do think that Kenny Pickett has an opportunity to improve, I don't know if it's going to be enough to automatically want to start the wide receivers in Pittsburgh. Deontay Johnson has a total of 3 catches for 33 yards in his last 2 games combined. And we already know that touchdowns are a little bit scarce when you're talking about Deontay Johnson. What about George Pickens, though? He hasn't had over 45 yards in a game since week 7. They barely even keep this dude on the field. He's struggling to even play 60% of the snaps right now. And each week, they continue to get lower and lower. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now this defense in Pittsburgh is a little bit banged up as well, but these two guys should be weekly top 30 wide receivers in fantasy football and started in almost all leagues. But unfortunately, in this offense, with this quarterback play, that's just been taken away from us here in fantasy football. Even if the play calling does improve, is Kenny Pickett going to be able to deliver more catchable balls to these wide receivers? There's just so many questions in this offense. I would prefer to see them on the field in a different type of offense without Matt Canada before trusting them in my fantasy lineup, because right now, I don't even know if I have room for him inside my top 30. On the other side of the football in Cincinnati, you remember those feelings I was talking about earlier when we were mentioning Garrett Wilson? I kind of feel a lot of the same way about Jamar Chase. Had that preseason high, looking forward to a huge season. Then he had to struggle through the Joe Burrow injury. Then Burrow gets healthy and Chase dominates, and then they lose Joe Burrow again. But now what? Moving forward with quarterback Jake Browning. Honestly, there's going to be a lot of unknown here as well. But I think we can all agree at this point, the ceiling of all the Cincinnati pass catchers has dropped a ton. They all become super touchdown dependent. And if I had to guess in this new offense, probably not going to be a whole lot of touchdowns to go around weekly. But this matchup isn't bad going up against Pittsburgh. They allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So honestly, a decent matchup here. Now we also do know that more than likely T. Higgins not going to be available in this game due to a hamstring injury. As for Tyler Boyd, I think I feel okay sitting him at this point of the fantasy season, but it's too hard to sit Jamar Chase. I mean, you have to think that they're going to absolutely just pepper him with targets, similar to what we saw most of the season with Garrett Wilson, but I have to drop him in my rankings. He's no longer some locked-in top 10 wide receiver. Right now, he's more of a top 24 option in fantasy football, and that pains my heart to say. Which will now take us out to Houston for the Texans and the Jaguars. And honestly, I thought about making this one my Manscaped matchup of the week, but I really didn't want to put any kind of jinx on Calvin Ridley because he finally did something big in week 11. A huge 7-catch, 103-yard, 2-touchdown day up against the Tennessee Titans. That was his first touchdown since week 4. All we need to do is give this guy targets weekly. For whatever reason in Jacksonville, it just doesn't seem to happen, but when they do, good things happen. Now, it did somewhat come at the expense of Christian Kirk in week 11, but for the most part, we know what Christian Kirk is. He's a solid wide receiver too, and he's the safest bet in Jacksonville. He scored over 10 fantasy points in a game, now 7 of the 10 games he's played this season. But did the Jags really just turn the corner, or was week 11 some kind of outlier? Because now they get a matchup going up against Houston. They allow the 19th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they are much easier to throw on than they are to run on. Overall, right now, this Jacksonville offense is fairly healthy, and we just saw a healthy Joe Burrow and the Bengals have 2 100-yard receivers in their game against Houston just 2 weeks ago. There is nothing holding Jacksonville back from having the exact same thing happen this week up against against Houston. While I'm not going to just rush Calvin Ridley back up inside my top 15, he will be somebody who's verged top 25 to 30 or so, right up there with Christian Kirk. But what about Houston? Look what CJ Stroud has done. He has given us 3 fantasy viable wide receivers in Houston. Both Nico Collins and Tank Dell right now are up inside the top 17 overall wide receivers on the season. Tank has had 3 huge games in a row. Nico has scored over 10 fantasy points now in 3 of his last 4 ball games. And it's just crazy to see what Tank Dell is doing right now because of the volume he's seen. 3 straight big games, 3 straight games with over 10 targets. It really makes you wonder why they weren't giving him huge volume all year long. That was my biggest gripe to start the season. Every time they gave that kid an opportunity, he did something with it. They just didn't give it to him very often. He didn't have over 4 targets in a game in 4 of the first 6 games of the season. But now he's absolutely thriving because of the volume. Now they get a matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow the 14th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. As of right now, it is still unclear whether or not we're going to have wide receiver Noah Brown back in this offense or not. If he does return, what happens to the target share? I'm seriously hoping it kind of goes 50-50 or so with Nico and they don't mess with Tank. But with the way things are sitting right now, both Nico Collins and Tank Dell are going to be weekly options in your fantasy football lineup. We'll kind of just wait and see what happens with Noah Brown. But in a great matchup like this against Jacksonville, and with how well that CJ Stroud is playing, Tank Dell and Nico Collins, both top 30 plays in week 12. Which will now take us up to Indy for the Colts and the Bucks, and we'll kick it off in Tampa Bay because, listen, I got a crazy stat right here. Justin Jefferson has missed the last 6 games of the season and has still scored more points than Chris Godwin. That right there is disgusting. It's disappointing. I'd kind of like to have the old Chris Godwin offense back if possible, but it's really the Mike Evans show every single week in Tampa Bay. He's the current wide receiver 9 overall and has scored at least 10 fantasy points in 80% of the games he's played this season. Godwin, on the other hand, has had like 2 fantasy startable weeks all year long. Baker clearly looks down the field for Mike Evans early and often, and it really makes Mike Evans a weekly must-start guy. But now they get a matchup going up against Indianapolis, who allows the 18th most fantasy points per game, so really kind of right around the league median, the league average or so. But the offensive line is tore up in Tampa, and their defense is an injured mess. Because of that, they're giving up a lot of yards and points, which means the offense has to continue to throw the ball all 4 quarters, which is why we love ourselves some Mike Evans. Now, unless you're in some crazy deep league, a large league, 16 teams or more, Chris Godwin, probably not really an option for you. The continual low ceiling and low production is just annoying to see in your fantasy football lineup. Evans, on the other hand, he'll be verged top 12 in my rankings here in week 12. What about Indianapolis? And what a great way for them to kick off the second half of the season, coming off the bye week with a matchup against Tampa Bay, a defense riddled with injuries like we just mentioned, and they give up big time points to opposing wide receivers. Now, Michael Pittman, obviously he remains the safer option. He's basically a weekly must start for most people who own him. He's currently the wide receiver 16 overall and is averaging 12.1 fantasy points per game. We know we start him every single week, like I said, but what about Josh Downs? He'd been dealing with a knee injury prior to the bye week. He only had 4 targets combined in the 2 games prior to the bye week. But before that, he'd been seeing great volume, 6+ targets a game almost, and this is an absolutely perfect matchup for him. Tampa Bay allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and as of right now, Josh Downs isn't on the Week 12 injury report. Like I said, we know we start Michael Pittman, but this could be one of those sneaky opportunities to throw Josh Downs in a lineup as well. Now, he comes with a lot of risk, but the potential reward is huge if you need a wide receiver. But now we head out to New York for the Giants and the Patriots, and honestly, there's not a lot to talk about in this matchup, so we're not going to waste a whole lot of time here on Thanksgiving week. In New England, the only guy remotely worth considering is Pop Douglas, Demario Douglas, but in a week with no bye weeks, I don't know if there's many teams that are actually going to need him. He only has 1 game all year long where he scored double-digit fantasy points, and the quarterback situation right now in New England is an absolute hot mess. This overall offense scores the second fewest points in all of the NFL. But I still wanted to mention him because the matchup is that good. The Giants allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Devontae Parker is still technically questionable at the time of this recording. He's more of a flex option at best, and I sure hope you play in some form of PPR scoring if you're going to use him. If you don't consider it, but there's a decent floor. The ceiling is just like troll-sized. How about for the New York Giants? I'm just not interested. Sure, Darius Slayton just had himself a great game last week, but it was against Washington, and everyone has good games against Washington because their defense sucks. This is a much more difficult matchup this week, going up against New England, who's coming off of their bye. If you were to add up all the fantasy viable games that all of the New York wide receivers have had this season, the number would be less than 5. Honestly, it's so bad, I'm not even going to waste my time finding out what the actual number is. I just know it's less than 5. Sorry, this is just not where I'm putting my fantasy eggs in week 12. But now we'll head down to Tennessee for the Titans and the Panthers, and for Carolina, there still isn't any other Carolina wide receiver worth mentioning other than Adam Thielen, and even his production has seen a dip here in the last couple of weeks. He's still the wide receiver 11 overall, averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game. This Carolina offense, though, is just that bad. Bryce Young, sorry, he was the wrong pick at number 1 overall. The offensive line can't protect him. The coaching decisions are weird to say the least, and the only true consistent here week in and week out is Adam Thielen volume. He's averaging right at 10 targets per game, but over the last month, those targets have been getting shorter and shorter. They're not going deep down the field very much. Bryce Young has no time in the pocket, and Adam Thielen can't get down the field for larger receptions. But now a matchup going up against Tennessee, and it's a good matchup. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Now, given the volume and the decent matchup, I can see a solid floor here once again for Adam Thielen. I really missed the early season touchdowns, but Bryce Young can't find the end zone to save his life right now. But really, a lot of the same can be said down in Tennessee for DeAndre Hopkins. He's the only guy worth mentioning there, especially in a week with no bye weeks, but he did find the end zone last week, which is great because he hadn't really done anything since that big blow-up game a few weeks back in Will Levis's first start. In fact, he hasn't eclipsed 60 yards in a game since then. And a lot of it has to do with the passing volume in this overall offense. It's super hit or miss. They only threw the ball 17 times in week 11. They only ran 40 offensive plays. Typically, NFL teams run right around 60 offensive snaps a game. What the hell is Tennessee doing? This is just not some high-powered passing offense that we can count on weekly, and this matchup isn't very easy. Carolina allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. The inconsistent volume, the lack of scoring overall in Tennessee, and the tough matchup here, it's going to put DeAndre Hopkins somewhere in the neighborhood of wide receiver 20 to 30 in my rankings. Which will take us out to Arizona for the Cardinals and the Rams. And for LA, we really don't know what to think as of right now because everyone is hurt and on the injured list. Cooper Kupp, he suffered a low ankle sprain in week 11, missed most of that game. Puka Nacua, currently on the injury report with a shoulder injury. He's questionable to play. We know that Matthew Stafford took multiple big hits in week 11. Ben Skoranek, he's questionable with a hip pointer, but hey, at least they're getting running back Kyren Williams back just in time to face the Arizona Cardinals. Now, Cooper Kupp, he's struggled for multiple weeks in a row now. We already know that, but Puka's worst game of the season came against these Arizona Cardinals earlier in the year. Now, that could be a little bit of an outlier because Arizona does allow the 13th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but as of right now, really the only healthy wide receiver is Tutu Atwell, and he hasn't had over 31 yards receiving in a game since week 3. At this point, I'm a little bit more worried about Cooper Kupp than I am Puka Nacua. If Kupp had been absolutely killing it prior to this, then okay, maybe I understand, but he's already been struggling. Puka really has been the more consistent option in this offense majority of the season. We just need to wait and find out who's going to be available here this week, and we may not know until the weekend. Now, if both Kupp and Puka are a full go, we know we throw them in our fantasy lineups. If they're limited, I just feel a little bit better about Puka going forward. How about the Arizona Cardinals? And somehow, Marquise Hollywood Brown was so much better with Josh Dobbs as his quarterback. In the 2 games this season with Kyler Murray, Hollywood Brown has a total Total combined, 3 catches for 46 yards and -6 yards rushing. Kyler actually started to look towards old reliable Greg Dortch, or as we like to call him over here, Big Dortch energy. I mean, he led the team in targets with 8. Led them in receptions with 6, and in yards with 76. But we also know that rookie wide receiver Michael Wilson wasn't active in week 11, and we do not know if he's going to be able to make it here into week 12. But now they get a matchup going up against the Rams, and they're right around the league average when it comes to opposing points to fantasy wide receivers. If anything, the way that Kyler is spreading the ball around now is killing Hollywood Brown in this offense, and honestly, it could get worse if Michael Wilson does return. Hollywood's really turned into a big-time touchdown-dependent wide receiver with a lot of risk each and every week. Right now, it really looks like all the wide receivers are going to eat into each other's floor and ceiling, and all of them probably going to be outside my top 30. Which will then take us up to Denver for the Broncos and the Browns. We'll kick it off with Cleveland because do you remember last week all those nice things that I said about Amari Cooper? How he's just a safe floor play, right? A solid low-end wide receiver 2 each and every week. And then they plugged in DTR instead of PJ Walker, and all of a sudden, a lot of the value of Amari Cooper went into the toilet. Don't get me wrong, I like DTR, but not as a volume passer in this offense that's going to absolutely force feed Amari Cooper. Cooper was actually second on the team in targets to David Njoku, who had 15 targets in week 11. Everything else was just dink and dunk down the field and really didn't result in many fantasy points. And then we get this matchup this week going up against Denver. It's going to be even more difficult for them. Denver allows the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and honestly, they've been playing great football here as of late. Now, we know that Amari Cooper has the ability to take one pass the distance for a good fantasy day, but given the quarterback play and this matchup on the road, he comes with huge risk in week 12. How about for Denver? Now, I've said it multiple times, and I'm going to damn say it again. I am 100% convinced that if Courtland Sutton could see close to 10 targets a week, he would be well inside the top 12 overall fantasy wide receivers for the season. But for whatever reason, Russ just doesn't throw him the ball until it's late in the ball game. Everything is a short dump-off pass for 3 quarters. It's like he's trying to preserve some high completion percentage, but when he throws it up to Courtland Sutton, good things continue to happen. Sutton right now is currently the wide receiver 18 overall. 70% of his games this season have resulted in over 10 fantasy points, and he has touchdowns in 8 of the 10 games he's played this season. Now he gets a matchup against Cleveland, and that absolutely blows. Cleveland allows the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Russ isn't going to have a whole lot of time in the pocket, and Sutton already doesn't see huge volume. If he doesn't score this game, you are in trouble if he's in your fantasy lineup. Scoring is probably going to be pretty limited in this matchup as well. I may have to put Courtland Sutton lower in my rankings, maybe just on the outside looking in of the top 30. Which now brings us out to Las Vegas for the Raiders, and the Chiefs will kick it off in Kansas City because just when we thought that Rashee Rice was able to take a step forward in this offense and really be maybe their number 1 option outside of Travis Kelce, they decided to start force-feeding the ball down the field to Justin Watson. He led the team in all categories, 11 targets, 5 receptions, 53 yards, and a touchdown, even had more targets than Travis Kelce. Now, I don't know if you agree with it or not, but if you watch that game, I still feel like every time the ball gets in the hands of Rashee Rice, he just looks better. He's able to do something with it after the ball is in his hands, and that's not really something we see continually from the wide receivers in Kansas City. So what do we do going forward? Because now they have a matchup going up against the Raiders, and they allow the 12th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This really makes all the wide receivers, once again in Kansas City, not startable. There were 10 players that received targets last week in week 11, and every single week, the only way that a wide receiver on this team is going to score double-digit points, it's going to have to be because of a touchdown. Now, with the way that this offense continues to struggle, and with Travis Kelce basically getting a weekly touchdown himself, that doesn't really leave a whole lot for the wide receivers. All of their floors are going to be extremely low, and like I said, they're going to be big play touchdown dependent. So like we did at the start of the season, let's do it now in week 12 We're going back to playing whack-a-mole. If I had to choose one, and part of me wants to say MVS, right? Try to get him back on track, get his mentals back on track after really dropping the game in week 11. I can see Patrick Mahomes giving him an opportunity in week 12 to try and right the ship, but honestly, that dude doesn't get enough targets to do anything. I'm still going back to the well of Rashee Rice. When they get the ball in his hands, he just looks like the best option in this offense, not named Travis Kelce. All right, how about for Las Vegas? And who saw what Kansas City did last week against A.J. Brown and are now worried about what potentially could happen this week to Davante Adams? Well, you really should be a little bit worried because this isn't some smash matchup for Davante Adams. He continues to go out and get great volume, but so much of it just isn't catchable. He hasn't had a game with over a 60% catch rate now since week 5, and he just got his first touchdown since week 3. We know this Raiders team isn't going to be one of those offenses that put up a lot of points through the air. And then on top of that, we have Jacoby Myers, who just had his best game in quite some time, like a month. Even that was only 4 catches for 49 yards. Yeah, that's not a whole lot for Jacoby Myers either. But now this matchup going up against Kansas City, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This one to me, though, is really all about the Chiefs' defense. This team has to enter this game with a must-win mentality after losing to Philadelphia. Adams is obviously going to be a start for almost every fantasy team out there that owns him, but he's not going to be highly ranked. Looking at him more as like a top 20 option this week at best. Which then takes us up to Philly. For the Eagles and the Bills, this should be a fun game to watch. And right here, this is a get-right game for so many of us in fantasy football. Both Stephon Diggs and A.J. Brown have kind of let us down here as of late. We need them to bounce back this week for sure. And it really should be a little bit easier for Stephon Diggs, but he needs it bad. Buffalo finally looked a lot better last week, but it wasn't because of Stephon Diggs. He only had 4 catches for 27 yards. His second straight game now with less than 35 yards receiving. You have to think that it's going to be in the Bills' game plan this week to force feed the ball to Stephon Diggs to get that portion of the offense going. I mean, do we really trust in Gabe Davis? I mean, come on. 4 of his last 6 games have resulted in less than 2 fantasy points. It would be a 2023 thing for this to be a Gabe Davis week, right? But now a matchup going up against Philadelphia, they allow the most, more than any other team in football, the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Really, honestly, Khalil Shakir is a name that I actually trust a little bit more than Gabe Davis. He's really not seen enough volume each and every week to be a safe start, but if I had to choose between the two, at least he doesn't go out there and put up a goose egg. However, for Stephon Diggs, probably going to be a top 5 option for me here this week. For Philadelphia, it's weird to see A.J. Brown struggle, right? After 6 straight games of over 120 yards receiving, we now have back-to-back games for A.J. Brown with less than 70 yards receiving, including whatever that disaster was just last week against Kansas City, where he had 1 catch for 8 yards. Yeah, I know that hurt a ton of people, but you still never ever sit A.J. Brown. But just like I said last week as well, we have to continue to throw out Devontae Smith and do it consistently every single week that Dallas Goedert is not in this lineup. It is a well-known fact by now that when Goedert isn't on the field, Devontae Smith just does better. And we really saw it once again in week 11, right? Devontae Smith, 6 catches for 99 yards, led the Eagles in receiving. But now a matchup going up against Buffalo, and on paper it says they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but this defense is banged up, and there is no way they are as shut down now as they were earlier in the season. Now, Jalen Hurts really said it best after the Monday night game. He said, "We keep winning ball games, but we're not even playing our best football yet. In a big-time game like this, going up against Buffalo, I'm looking for both A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith to have top 20 days." Which will take us back out to LA for the Chargers and the Ravens. We'll kick it off with Baltimore. And let's just say this is a great opportunity for multiple Baltimore wide receivers to have a huge week. They almost had it in week 11, but Zay Flowers had a huge touchdown called back due to some type of phantom penalty. But this week, he's going to have another shot at that for sure. We also got to see vintage OBJ in week 11, his first 100-yard game since 2021, and he looked really good. The biggest question surrounding him is the health of his shoulder. We saw him take a huge shot late in that ball game, and now he's questionable on the injury report. Now, they said he escaped any major injury, so it sounds like he has a pretty decent shot of being in our lineups here this week, which should be great because they're going up against the Los Angeles Chargers, and they allow the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. If he's healthy, Odell Beckham becomes a fantasy viable option this week, along with Zay Flowers. Because when you get a matchup like this going up against LA, more than one wide receiver has the opportunity to eat in fantasy football. They may not be highly ranked wide receivers, but they're definitely going to have a great opportunity. Now, obviously, there's going to be some risk that comes along with them. We've seen Baltimore really rely on the run in the past, and if they do that again, it obviously limits the ceiling to their pass catchers. But with no Mark Andrews, Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers against the Chargers, definitely fantasy options. Now, as for LA, the only guy that we can really talk about there is Keenan Allen. This guy is on a career pace in almost every statistical category and just continues to go out weekly and do it over and over and over again. The current wide receiver 2 overall in fantasy football, averaging just over 19 fantasy points per game, and has scored at least 10 fantasy points in 90% of his games this season. All the other wide receiver options in LA are either hurt or they have oven mitts for hands. You know Justin Herbert's going to have to throw the ball, and he has no choice but to throw the direction of Keenan Allen over 10 times a game. But this is no easy matchup. Going up against Baltimore, they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But really, there's just too many injuries on this offense for us to not stick with Keenan Allen, despite it being a difficult matchup. Plus, like we've talked about multiple times, we know he plays out of the slot, which definitely benefits him in tough matchups like this. His ceiling probably going to be a lot lower, but the volume is going to be there, and that should help with his floor, hopefully keeping him right around a top 12 play in week 12. Which will only leave us Monday Night Football, a matchup of the Minnesota Vikings and Chicago Bears. And look what happened to DJ Moore. Justin Fields came back from injury, and DJ Moore immediately started scoring fantasy points once again. In week 11, 7 catches, 96 yards, and a touchdown. It was his first touchdown since week 5. It was also the first time since week 5 that DJ Moore averaged over 10 yards per target. Justin Fields just raises the ceiling weekly for DJ Moore and gives him more chances down the field. There's no other wide receiver right now in Chicago that's seen anything close to the volume that DJ Moore is, and it's really going to keep him as a top 15 guy here going forward as long as Justin Fields is healthy. Now, a matchup going up against Minnesota, they allow the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Now, we know that DJ Moore endured Tyson Bagent for the middle part of this season, and as of right now, with Fields back, he's still a top 10 overall wide receiver in the bright lights of a primetime game. Could we see DJ Moore go the hell off again? But what about on the other side of the football for Minnesota? Really, the only thing that anyone cares about once again is the health and availability of Justin Jefferson. And honestly, he needs to come back. If he's ready, he needs to play because Minnesota has entered must-win territory. But they also have the bye coming up next week, so they could choose to rest him. The one thing that I can say, don't be surprised if you don't hear anything until after the Thanksgiving holiday. Jefferson has already come out on social media and talked about, hey, I don't care how many fans send me DMs, it's not going to rush me back on the field. But you have to think that if Minnesota thinks he's good to go and he thinks he's good to go, he should be on the field this week going up against Chicago. They allow the 17th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, kind of a middle-of-the-pack defense. As for Jordan Addison, though, in this offense, he hasn't had a game yet with Josh Dobbs under center where he scored at least 10 fantasy points. He's really made him a flex play at best, maybe a wide receiver 3 in deeper leagues. Everyone right now is waiting to hear about Justin Jefferson. And if he's 100% full go, he's the guy going back into the lineup. Now, if word comes out that Jefferson is going to sit, Jordan Addison probably going to be one of those Verge top 30 plays, probably more closer to that 36 range, just because we haven't seen that ceiling since Dobbs has taken over. All right, that's going to do it for my Week 12 wide receiver start and sit video. We are trying to pump out videos faster than maybe we ever have before. 9 videos in 3 days, so you have all the information you need before all the games on Thanksgiving. Now, typically we drop our rankings on Thursday, but not this week. They'll all be out on Wednesday, so you can make those final lineup decisions. Just a quick reminder before we get out of here for the day, though, be sure to click that link down below in the description, compassion.com/headliners. Let's help some kids here during the holiday season. Plus, you gotta hit the like button and leave a comment. because I know there's people out here that are going to want this Davante Adams signed mini helmet right here from our friends over at Pristine Auction. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and then please have a very, very happy Thanksgiving and enjoy some time with your family here this weekend. I know I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. And then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.